The Mexican Grand Prix delivered an absolutely amazing race that is undoubtedly one of the best of the season. There were some amazing overtakes, great racing, moments of controversy, crashes, and even a little bit of heartbreak right at the end with the virtual safety car. Lando Norris also had a dominant weekend and now takes the lead in the Drivers' Championship over Oscar Piastri by just one single point. Oscar himself had an okay and decent recovery drive after a pretty shocking qualifying, and Max Verstappen delivered an even better recovery drive to the podium, but it just makes the championship even tighter heading into the next round in Brazil. There were so many incidents and moments to talk about that is exactly what I'm getting into in this video with my thoughts on all of the biggest incidents. The first incident that I want to talk about is actually one that didn't appear on the live coverage, which was Liam Lawson missing two Marshals that were recovering debris on the racetrack at the beginning of the race. Now, this was a really dangerous and kind of scary incident as well. We didn't see it on the live coverage, but we saw a little bit of footage of it after the race from both Lawson's point of view and also some fan footage from the grandstands. And yeah, to say that this was scary is probably even understating it because it could have been a lot worse. Now, in terms of what happened, Liam Lawson had contact with Sainz on lap 1, he then had to pit, and when he came out of the pits going into turn 1, albeit it was under double waved yellows, there was Marshals picking up debris, and they should not have been there. There should never be Marshals, even under double waved yellows when cars are going through, and it was just a really scary incident. Understandably so, Lawson had a very kind of big dramatic reaction to this on seeing people on the track, Marshals, as he's driving by. He said, "Oh my god, are you kidding me? I mean, did you see that? Oh my god, dude, I could have killed them." So yeah, it definitely kind of shook Lawson, understandably so, and it was just a really shocking thing to see in general. And now, in terms of how those Marshals ended up there at that specific time when a car was making its way around that corner, because usually we do sometimes see Marshals at the end of lap 1 or lap 2 on the track collecting debris, but that is always when there is a gap in the traffic, especially at the beginning of the race because the field is obviously very congested. There usually is a gap somewhere, so that's when they try to insert the Marshals. But yeah, this was a scary incident because Lawson should not have been there at the same time as the Marshals. Now, the FIA is still investigating. They don't 100% know how this happened, but an FIA spokesperson said this: "Following a turn 1 incident, race control was informed that debris was present on the track at the apex of that corner. On lap 3, Marshals were alerted and placed on standby to enter the track and recover the debris once all cars had passed turn 1. As soon as it became apparent that Lawson had pitted, the instruction to dispatch the Marshals was rescinded and a double yellow flag was shown in that area. We are still investigating what occurred after that point." There was clearly some kind of miscommunication because even though the FIA put them on standby, the moment that they saw Lawson that he was going to pit and he was going to come out onto the track, they rescinded that order. So the fact that the Marshals still ended up on track, something went wrong in terms of the communication, whether that's with the Marshals themselves or maybe the main Marshal in the Marshal post. That is something that the FIA is going to have to investigate, because seeing Formula 1 cars even driving under double waved yellow speeds and coming out the pit, it's not as if Lawson was going extremely fast, but seeing Formula 1 cars and human beings on the track is just terrifying under any circumstance, and it's not even worth thinking about the consequences, to be honest. So yeah, definitely the scariest moment from the race. So now let's get into some actual racing, and kicking off straight away with lap 1 turn 1 and all of that cutting across the grass shenanigans. Now, in terms of Max Verstappen, I want to start with Max because I think what he did was totally fair, not in the way that he cut the grass, but the way that he actually slotted back and gave back the positions in a fair way. I know that George was a little bit critical of Max, which I found a little bit strange. Max was more than ahead of George Russell. He wasn't even fighting with George going into the corner. He was fighting with Leclerc and Hamilton, and even though he did kind of lock up, make a mistake and cut across the grass and gain an advantage, he did totally the right thing and slotted back into P4, which was kind of the last position that he got legally and fairly. So Max did everything right in that situation, and I don't really think George Russell had a case to be frustrated with Max. However, having said that, now let's talk about Charles Leclerc, and I'm going to say right from the outset that I can't believe Leclerc got away with what he did at turn 1 and didn't even get investigated, didn't even get noted for cutting the corner and keeping that position. Hamilton essentially had overtaken Leclerc going into turn 1, he had the majority of his car ahead of Charles, and he even left space for Leclerc going into turn 2. In my opinion, Charles cut to the grass way too easily and way too soon when, again, in my opinion, he had full control of his car and could have made the corner. If you actually listen to his onboard, which obviously I can't kind of demonstrate in this video, and more importantly, if you look at George Russell's onboard, who's the car behind, he just chooses to steer left very early, and more than anything else, if you listen to his onboard, he basically gets back on the throttle. Now, if you are able to get back onto the throttle, then you are in full control of your car. I mean, in a road car, if you're spinning out, if you're out of control, you don't suddenly then just go back on the throttle, you continue to brake. So yeah, I think Leclerc could have made that corner if he tried, but he just took way too big of a liberty of going onto the grass way too early. And what I find really interesting is that if you compare it to Piastri's onboard, who kind of had a similar incident and turned up in kind of a similar moment of the track where it's a little bit slippy, it's a little bit kind of bumpy at that point as well, his mindset was to stay on the track, which is exactly what he did, whilst Leclerc's mindset way too early was just take a massive liberty and cut the track. It is ironic that Piastri, if you compare their onboards, by choosing to do the right thing and slowing his car down enough to make the corner, actually lost positions because of it, whilst Leclerc chose to cut the corner and was able to keep a position because of it. And now, I get that on lap 1, we usually get a little bit more leniency from the stewards, and overall, I actually think that's a good thing because it promotes more racing. It allows the drivers to be that little bit more aggressive on lap 1. They kind of can be a bit more feisty as well. And again, that's good for the fans. But I think Leclerc crossed the line, and you have to have a line somewhere. I think he should have been punished either by being asked to give the place back to Hamilton or potentially given a 10-second penalty, because that's exactly what Lewis then got later in the race for gaining an advantage. I think the fact that they were teammates definitely had an effect because I think Ferrari didn't want to intervene and disadvantage one of their drivers. I think in their eyes, it was kind of the perfect situation running second and third. But for the stewards, that should not kind of come into their judgment. It doesn't matter whether drivers are teammates or on opposite teams. They should have done something about Leclerc because I think he definitely went over the line. I also think in terms of that turn 1 and turn 2 complex, I think they need to add gravel because the grass just makes it too easy for drivers to take liberties and just cut across it, which sets a ridiculous precedent for the entire race. It makes it inconsistent for the stewarding and the racing in general, and I just think something needs to change. And next up, let's talk about Hamilton and Verstappen at turns 1 and 2. And now I'm going to get to Lewis's kind of shenanigans at turn 4 a little bit later. To me, that's almost a separate incident, but in terms of that initial battle, whilst it was right on the limit, it was very hard racing. I think it was just about fair in my opinion. Max did manage to get his car alongside and just ahead of Lewis. He clearly rolled off the brake a little bit, which is kind of what initiated that contact, which I don't think Lewis was a big fan of. So yeah, that might have been just over, but I think in general, it was just about fair. It was just on the right side of what I think is very hard, but really entertaining racing. And it's kind of similar to what Piastri did to Verstappen in Jeddah. And next up we get to a little bit further down the road and Lewis's 10-second penalty. Now, the thing I didn't realize at the time is that Lewis was actually investigated for 2 separate incidents during kind of that corner. He was investigated for not joining the correct runoff road, which they actually cleared him off because they said that given the speed that he was doing, he did a good enough job to make a good enough effort to follow that road. And then he was also investigated for gaining an advantage by leaving the track. Now, there is no doubt that Lewis definitely gained time. I think it was also made a little bit more difficult by the fact that Ollie Behrman then joined the party as well and that he was battling with Max, so that was kind of a little third element that made things even more complicated. But I do think that Ferrari also have a little bit of accountability because I think what they should have done is told Lewis to give some of the gap back to the cars behind, but not actually let them past. I think there's definitely a world where the stewards perhaps would have taken that because it was very close going into the corner. It was still being contested between Lewis and Max, and obviously then Ollie just joined the party out of nowhere. So potentially if Ferrari had just kind of acted upon that and told Lewis to give the advantage back without giving the position, maybe Lewis wouldn't have got a penalty. I do, however, still understand Lewis's anger because he saw Leclerc at the beginning of the race cut the track on purpose and be able to keep his position. He also saw Max kind of cut to the grass when he maybe didn't need to and maybe could have potentially made the corner and still was able to keep the position. And then, so for him to get a 10-second penalty for a genuine mistake when the others meant to cut across the grass, I kind of understand his anger. And it's also kind of worth pointing out that 10 seconds was a very, very big penalty for Lewis in Mexico, especially when you consider that Max in Jeddah got 5 seconds for cutting the track and gaining and keeping a position. Having said that, I actually don't mind that Lewis got a penalty. I think it was the right decision by the stewards because even watching it live, I didn't feel that Lewis deserved to be ahead of Max. They were going into the corner side by side. I think Max perhaps had the corner because he was on the inside. And again, even in the moment when I saw Lewis go wide, I was like, yeah, he's going to get a penalty for rejoining the track and gaining that position. But I think for me, and the anger that I have, and also clearly Lewis as well, is just the inconsistency with what we saw from the beginning of the race. When you look at what Leclerc did by clearly doing it on purpose, cutting the corner and gaining a position, it makes Lewis's penalty kind of seem not only incredibly harsh given that it was 10 seconds, but also kind of unfair given the precedent that was set. I think that you either penalise both Leclerc on lap 1 and also Hamilton at turn 4, or neither. Especially when you take into account that Lewis and Max going into turn 4 were side by side and battling for the corner, whilst Leclerc on lap 1 was clearly behind Lewis. Last up, let's talk about the big incident at the end of the race that kind of totally killed the momentum at the end of the Grand Prix, and that was the late race VSC that was caused by Carlos Sainz that of course halted that kind of final lap showdown that we saw between Verstappen and Leclerc, and also Piastri and Behrman as well. Even though I was fuming in the moment and angry like everyone else was watching the race, once I've actually looked at the facts, looked at the onboards and the FIA's justification, I kind of understand and agree that the VSC was probably the right call. And now that is going to be a massively unpopular opinion, so I can't wait to see the comments of this one. But we all know in terms of how this incident started, Carlos Sainz spun out and crashed into the barrier, his car was damaged, he needed to retire from the race, and even though he drove into the escape road, he did not cross the entire threshold. And if you actually look at the color of the track where it changes from blue, which is the Grand Prix track, into kind of gray, which is the safe zone, he doesn't cross the entire threshold, and he actually leaves about 2/3 of his car still on the Grand Prix circuit. And now what then complicated matters even more is that the car then started to smoke, which is exactly what the FIA said in a statement, saying the car subsequently began smoking and race control received notifications of fire, making it clear that Marshal's intervention would be required for recovery. To me, in that situation, when you've got a car that is not fully in the safe zone, quite a bit of it is still on the Grand Prix track, and then also the fact that there is a fire, so there is an immediate danger that the stewards and even the marshals need to take care of, I just think they played it safe and did the right thing, because although a lot of people have made the case that it's the slowest part of the circuit and they should have just left it under double waved yellows, we have just seen Carlos Sainz crash at that exact corner. Now yes, they are going slower under double waved yellows, but they are still going very fast. If you remember, Leclerc and Verstappen were pushing those double waved yellows to the absolute limit because they were so hungry fighting for P2. That is two drivers who are still driving at a very fast speed, and the slightest kind of blip of the throttle over the curb, the slightest kind of strange deployment of electrical energy and maybe torque, and either of them could do exactly what Sainz did and potentially crash into the marshals. Or whenever you're putting marshals onto the track, which is dangerous at the best of times, and even more so when there's potentially a fire involved, when they're having to go onto the track where a car has just spun out and crashed out, I just think that it's better to be safe rather than sorry, and I think more than anything else, it was just an unfortunate timing of events. Had it happened with about 5 or 6 laps to go, we still would have got 3 or 4 laps of racing. You're not going to hear me defend the FIA a lot on my channel, but when I really do think that they made the right choice, I am going to defend them, and I do think that they made the right decision at the end of the race. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.